So why am I holding a black sock in my hand? We'll find out. There's this idea that, and it's a very plausible idea, that the Middle Ages was invented. It was invented by the Catholic Church. It's been around since 1991 in a theory developed by a professor, Herbert Illig was his name. And what he discovered was, and it had been known for a long time, but really came to a fore in the 60s, was that there was a complete lack of historical documentation for the period we know as the Middle Ages. They weren't there. The only sources you had for the Middle Ages was books produced by the Vatican. Now this guy Illig eventually came to the conclusion that under the reign of Pope Sylvester II, whose real name was Gilbert, and he was an occultist based out of Córdoba in Spain and also in France. And yes, a black magician was made Pope. If you don't believe me, I wrote all about it in my much loved book, Sorcerer, The Invocation of Strangeness, linked down below. That's how much of a treasure trove this book is. Now, this has not been a hotly debated topic, other than the usual sort of mainstream academics from the top universities knocking it, but they haven't really given proof of why it might be wrong. They're just saying the documentation isn't there. And it should be there. But not only is the documentation not there, the theory gets more and more plausible when you add in the work of a Russian mathematician called Fomenko, who since 1973, also in the Soviet Union, and this came probably from a communist agenda, discovered the same thing, that a whole section of history, what we call the Middle Ages, was missing. And then he did something quite brilliant. What he did then was, he started to calculate lunar cycles back in time, according to things like eclipses, and discovered that all the eclipses mentioned in the documents of the Middle Ages didn't take place at the times they said they did. If they did, they would have been completely out of whack with lunar cycles. Therefore, they were invented or they were moved to a different time. As a result, the Middle Ages, again, didn't exist, and the primary suspect in all this was, again, Pope Sylvester II, reading about him here, an occultist known as a Gilbert. Now, why is this important? Oh, it's hugely important, and especially for me in this channel. As you know, I believe that paganism lasted a hell of a lot longer than what the Christians said it did. There are reasons for this and evidence for this. Up until the Renaissance, they were still writing about people in County Cavan here in Ireland worshipping the Crom Cruach, the last pagan god of Ireland. This was 1,000 years after St. Patrick. And this is another thing, all these saints probably didn't exist and were invented by these same religious Vatican sources. The same thing happens with the Round Towers of Ireland. We have absolutely no documentation, I wrote a book about that as well, link down below, telling us that the Round Towers of Ireland were built by Christians. They weren't. They were built by pagans using Roman technology in terms of lime mortar, and Christians altered them, or later, much later actually, that they put the conical domes on them to make them look like church spires in their alleged Middle Ages, I might add. Now, this has profound implications. So people will say, if the Middle Ages didn't exist, maybe that means that the Roman, the pagan, the classical era was much closer to where we are now than they were telling us. Well, that could be true, but it could also be the opposite. I'll explain in a second. Let's take why they did it. They started to massacre people who were not Christians in Europe. We had the Cathars were slaughtered. We had all the pagans, they were slaughtered as well. The church wanted to make out that it was a big, long effort and process to bring Europe into Christianity, and it took a long, long time. Maybe it did, but then all of a sudden everyone was Christian. No, I don't believe that at all. I believe that paganism lasted until probably the Renaissance in many places. And the fact that the Renaissance even exists, which remember was a renaissance of the classical pagan world, kind of demonstrates that maybe it never went away to begin with. See, there's a lot of things in history that don't make sense. Now, and basically it comes with timelines. And when you have someone like Fomenko using lunar cycles, which is hard evidence and indisputable evidence to prove conclusively that huge sections of history just don't exist, coupled with the fact that you have no referring documents to say the existence of people like Charlemagne and his great Christian crusades against the Saxons, we have something really big here. Now, what does that mean for us who are interested in ancient times? You'll say, well, we know for a fact that we have ash pits that are from the Neolithic period that date to 5,000 using carbon dating. Correct. What about the likes of Stonehenge and stuff? Well, they lift the stones up in the 50s and they got some soil from underneath and they can carbon date that. But the problem with that is that's a nonsense idea, because everything from rabbits to worms to ants can burrow under there and move all the soil around, and they have thousands of years to do it. So we still don't really know how old Stonehenge and those Neolithic monuments are, except for things like bodies and ash pits buried nearby, and bang on, they're in the Neolithic 5,000 years ago. So it's a good guess there. It's a very good suggestion. So what does that mean in terms of it? So that the first thing you would think is like, then history is like this sock, right? Everything has been, if the Middle Ages have been removed, everything has been narrowed down. Ancient Rome is closer to us today. I don't know about that. It could also be a way of tidying up history in order to make it fit in well with the Bible. Very, very likely. Which means that if you actually take those editorialized, abridged versions of history called the Middle Ages out, it actually expands history. And it puts not only, now remember, this is when you expand something along a linear line, you're not only expanding the edge further away from each other, but you're also moving what was once down here into the middle and what was down here further back. This means that human history is actually much longer. To paraphrase our friend Graham Hancock, stuff is getting older, and it does. But if you want to pull all this neatly into fit with the Bible, in the year of Lucius, the 6,000 years ago, wherever it was, or 4,000 years ago, it would be in your interest to editorialize and tighten it up. Therefore, the ancients are not as ancient, the pagan world doesn't last as long, and Christianity and Western civilization as we know it from the Christian viewpoint, the Judeo-Christian viewpoint, is much longer than it should be, because everything has gone back in. In reality, what would happen is that the pagan world would be much, much longer. Much, much longer. Now, other than the evidence for that, what do we have? Well, all the universities up until very recently were controlled by our friends, the Christians. What are Christians famous for? Being liars, being deceivers, being mass murderers, and pretty much nothing else. And therefore, they would have an interest in sexing up history to make them look better, to make it look like they really, really struggled to bring Europe into paganism. And they would give them an era that would be nice and tidy, and would also validate the timeline of the Bible. Remember that. That's a big part of it. They have to validate their crazy Bible text and migrations into Europe, and therefore they can invent all the saints like St. Patrick and St. David and St. Sebastian and all of them, and stick them all in the middle and make them all fit as the great kind of evangelists, St. John the Evangelist of history, who brought forward Christianity into the West. It's a very sinister thing, but we're dealing with the Vatican, and the Vatican is very sinister. And like I said, the Pope who is the primary suspect in this is Sylvester II, who was, as I mentioned, an occultist. An occultist openly, who was actually destroyed by a devil while he was giving Mass in the Vatican. I suspect that was some kind of ritual where a demon was invoked. This is what you Catholics are worshipping. I'm sorry, I hate to tell you that, but this is what you're worshipping. A demon was invoked and tore him to bits on the altar, and apparently his bones still rattle inside his crypt. It's really fascinating stuff when you think about it. But there you go, phantom time hypothesis and Fomenko's missing history according to lunar cycles. We have been sold a dud here. So therefore, anyone who comes up, it doesn't fit with the historical timeline. Now you can say, well, it doesn't. You're right. It doesn't fit. And then you can actually invoke hard evidence like Fomenko's lunar cycles to say, here's the proof. What does this mean? Well, it doesn't mean that everything in history is a lie. You're going to have people now saying, this proves the earth is flat, and this proves the mud flood, and this proves all. It's not going to prove that. Because, I mean, I had to deal with some guy telling me that Stonehenge was built in the 1950s because of the restoration that was done there in the 1950s. I have the book here somewhere, in the Penguin book, which was done because what happened was some travellers camped next to one of the tall trilithons, and they lit a fire, and the fire caused the trilithon to fall over, and Stonehenge was nearly completely destroyed. So they took that as a chance to restore it, though you have all these truthers who think that's when it was built. Anyway, even though there's records of it going back hundreds of years and photos going back to the 1800s, but and we have the Constable and Turner paintings of it. But anyway, just because some things are messed up doesn't mean everything is messed up. But yes, so I think it's a very plausible theory. It actually works very well in favour of the Catholic Church and Christianity as a whole. And of course it's going to be attacked because you have all these scholars who come out of Christ College, Cambridge, and Jesus Christ College, Oxford, and Mary Magdalene College, and Trinity College, and all these colleges named after Christian things. And I only think books like Catherine Nixie's The Darkening Age, somewhere here, only valid, I think that's there, the gold, I have your worst copy, the original copy, validates this theory. You cannot trust these Christian universities because they're all going to be there creating timelines. It also makes you think about things like the Tolkien knows stuff. The way Tolkien pushed history back much further. He played with Tolkien took the kind of Dark Ages, and if you really look at the chronology of like the Middle Earth in the Second Age, it is kind of like a vast rollover of the Dark Ages meeting both the classical era and a kind of a more Renaissance type era. So you often wonder if he suspected and knew things away, and that was his way of bleaking it out. But anyway, look after yourselves, you beautiful bastards.